Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
Picture this moment unfolding in my cramped little kitchen in Dayton, Ohio. On that particular Mother's Day morning when the sun slanted through the threadbare curtains, I'd hung myself back in the days when every penny counted toward making this old two-story house feel like a home. And there I stood arranging the mismatched plates on the dining table with its wobbly leg steadied by a folded section of the local newspaper, because even after all these years of widowhood, stretching back 8 long ones since Tom passed from that relentless cancer, I still hadn't splurged on repairs when Social Security checks and the kindness of church neighbors covered the basics just fine. And as the aroma of the ham baking in the oven mingled with the faint, lingering trace of Tom's pipe tobacco that seemed embedded in the very walls, my son Mark pulled up outside in his oversized black SUV that gleamed like it belonged on a showroom floor rather than a quiet suburban street lined with modest ranch houses and pickup trucks faded from years of honest work, stepping out with that practiced hug of his that always felt a touch too hurried. His expensive cologne cutting through the homely scents as he handed me a bouquet of carnations already starting to wilt from the drive over from the airport. Clearly picked up as an afterthought to fulfill some obligatory gesture rather than a heartfelt one born from the closeness we once shared before his tech career in Silicon Valley whisked him away into a world of boardrooms and bottom lines. We settled at the table shortly after, the same scarred oak piece where we'd celebrated countless holidays with laughter echoing off the paneled walls until life pulled us in different directions. And as I served up slices of the ham glazed with a simple honey mustard mix from ingredients I'd sourced affordably at the market down the road, drawing on recipes my own mother had taught me during lean times when a good meal was the glue holding family together amid economic hardships that hit the Midwest hard in the 70s and 80s, Mark cleared his throat in that deliberate manner he adopted after climbing the corporate ladder, the one signaling he was about to pose a question he believed carried the weight of paternal concern. Locking his gaze on mine across the steam rising from the scalloped potatoes I'd prepared with cheese from the church's food pantry donation, because those weekly drives ensured no one in our congregation went without, while fostering a sense of community that felt more genuine than any distant financial aid. And then he asked it outright, whether I was truly happy with the monthly transfers from Clara, amounting to around $12,000 each time. His tone laced with an expectation of gratitude that made my fork pause halfway to my mouth as the bite suddenly turned tasteless on my tongue, because happy seemed such an inadequate word for the complicated knot those automatic deposits twisted in my gut, appearing like clockwork in my bank statement as uninvited reminders of obligations unspoken and strings attached that tugged at my independence more than they supported it. I set the fork down gently on the floral pattern plate, one of a set chipped from decades of family gatherings where arguments were aired over pie rather than pent up behind polite facades, and met his eyes with a steadiness honed from years of facing down factory layoffs and medical crises without crumbling, replying that happy did not quite capture the reality of it all, since the church had stepped in to feed me in ways far beyond mere sustenance, providing not only overflowing baskets of canned goods and fresh produce from community gardens, but also the emotional nourishment of potluck suppers and prayer circles where women like me shared burdens without judgment or expectation of repayment. The very same First Presbyterian congregation where Tom and I had walked down the aisle in 1962. And renewed vows 3 decades later amid laughter and tears that bound us tighter than any legal document ever could. His expression froze in that instant, the color leaching from his face as if I'd unplugged the illusion he harbored about my reliance on their wired benevolence. A stillness that stretched across the table like the shadow of unspoken resentments we'd both nurtured separately over the years since he married Clara, and their lifestyle diverged so sharply from the grounded values we'd instilled in him during his boyhood summers, helping in Tom's auto parts shop where greasy hands and honest labor taught more about worth than any Silicon Valley seminar. And just as the weight of my words settled into the awkward hush broken only by the ticking of the wall clock inherited from my grandmother, the front door creaked open without a knock, announcing Clara's arrival in a swirl of perfume that overpowered the kitchen's comforting smells, her 5'8" frame clad in a silk blouse and tailored slacks that screamed high-end boutiques while her heels clicked authoritatively against the linoleum floor worn smooth from generations of footsteps, and slung casually over her shoulder was that designer handbag. A sleek leather masterpiece from some exclusive Paris atelier that I would later discover online cost upwards of $200,000. More than the entire value of this house we purchased in 1972 for $65,000 after Tom and I pulled every overtime dollar from his shifts at the assembly line to escape the cramped apartment where Mark was born. She entered without preamble, placing the bag on the sideboard near the stack of unread mail from church events and utility bills paid on time through careful budgeting. Leaning in for an air kiss that barely grazed my cheek with the cool detachment of someone accustomed to superficial affections, and in that fleeting opportunity amid the thickening tension, I seized the moment for my first subtle retaliation, a clever quip delivered with a smile that masked the underlying bite honed from too many overlooked slights. Remarking that the bag must surely contain the elixir for her perpetual radiance, or perhaps the ledger tracking all that generous monthly goodwill flowing my direction. And the way her manicured fingers tightened imperceptibly on the strap, while her eyes narrowed just a fraction, revealed I'd struck a nerve with precision, the satisfaction blooming quietly inside me like the first sip of strong coffee on a chilly morning, as it highlighted the ridiculous contrast between her ostentatious display and my self-sufficient simplicity, without escalating into outright confrontation. Yet before the echo of my words could fully dissipate, Mark leaned forward with his jaw set in determination, his voice cutting through the air as he demanded to understand precisely why I would turn my back on their help after depending on it for so long. Mark's demand sliced through the lingering aroma of the ham and potatoes like a knife through overcooked roast, pulling me inexorably back into the tangled web of how those monthly $12,000 transfers had woven themselves into my life in the first place. Commencing not long after Tom's funeral service at First Presbyterian, where the pews overflowed with neighbors who'd known us since the days when Dayton's factories hummed with activity and families like ours stretched every dollar from payday to payday without the safety net of extravagant inheritances or venture capital windfalls. And as I sat there across from him in the dining room, bathed in the soft afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains that billowed slightly from the open window, carrying scents of blooming lilacs from the yard where Tom had planted them himself during one of his rare weekends off from the auto parts shop he ran with a passion that kept our heads above water even through the brutal recessions of the early 2000s. The lawyer's office visit came flooding back in vivid detail. That stuffy downtown space with its walls lined in dark wood paneling and the air thick with the musty odor of old files stacked on shelves that sagged under the weight of decades of legal entanglements for working-class folks navigating estates and disputes without the luxury of high-priced attorneys, where the bespectacled man in the rumpled suit explained the intricacies of Tom's will that bequeath me this house free and clear, along with a life insurance payout modest enough to cover the funeral costs and a few months of mortgage payments before I turned to the church's benevolence fund for bridging the gaps. But he also delved into those peculiar side clauses involving Clara's affluent family from the East Coast, whose connections to Tom's business dealings dated back to when Mark first started dating her during his college years at Ohio State. A romance that blossomed amid tailgates and study sessions, but quickly escalated into a union that introduced opulence into our straightforward existence. And it turned out the payments originated from a blend of Clara's personal trust fund disbursements intended as familial goodwill and a more opaque non-disclosure agreement stemming from Tom's quiet financial maneuvers in the shop, where he'd occasionally bent rules on inventory sourcing to undercut competitors during lean times, actions that skirted the edges of regulations but ensured we could afford Mark's tuition without loans crushing our dreams. All of which Clara's lawyers had formalized to maintain silence on those irregularities in exchange for the ongoing support that I initially accepted with a mix of relief and reluctance, because the hospital bills from Tom's treatments had mounted higher than the snowdrifts in an Ohio winter, draining savings we'd built painstakingly over 35 years of marriage. Over time, however, as I immersed myself deeper into the church community where weekly Bible studies evolved into lifelines of shared meals and emotional bolstering from women who'd weathered their own storms of loss and hardship without fanfare. Those deposits began to feel less like lifelines and more like subtle chains forged from guilt and control, particularly since Clara's visits grew sporadic and agenda-driven, often laced with veiled suggestions about modernizing the house or relocating to assisted living nearer to them so they could oversee my affairs with the efficiency of their corporate schedules, ignoring how the very rhythm of my days now pulsed with the genuine camaraderie of potlucks featuring homemade pies and casseroles that nourish the soul as much as the body, far surpassing the impersonal ping of bank notifications that arrived like unwelcome intrusions into my reclaimed autonomy. Returning to the present with Mark's insistent gaze still fixed upon me, the brunch remnants scattered across the table like remnants of a battlefield strewn with unspoken grievances, I deflected his probing with a light chuckle that carried the dry humor I'd cultivated from years of observing life's ironies without bitterness overtaking me, remarking that if the church truly fed me in every sense now, perhaps it was high time for him to ponder what sustained his spirit beyond the relentless pursuit of promotions and properties that seemed to define success in his corner of the world while eroding the simple joys we'd once cherished, like backyard barbecues under string lights on summer evenings. A gentle prod at the core of how their marriage had reshaped him from the earnest boy who volunteered at church youth groups into a man whose worth was tallied in stock options rather than shared moments. And Clara's lips tightened in that telltale way, signaling her discomfort with any reminder of origins that clashed with her curated narrative of upward mobility, her fingers drumming idly on the designer bag that rested like a sentinel beside her chair. Seizing the opportunity to underscore my point with a touch of witty reprisal that would linger without immediate backlash, I rose from the table and ambled to the sideboard where I kept the collection of photo albums bound in faux leather covers yellowed from attic storage during the humid summers. Selecting one from Mark's formative years and flipping through its pages, filled with snapshots capturing the unpolished authenticity of family life before algorithms and influencers dictated perfection, landing on a particularly evocative image from his high school graduation ceremony in the spring of 1995, where he stood awkwardly in the rented cap and gown beside Tom, who, despite the early shadows of illness etching lines on his face, managed a broad grin that radiated pride earned through sacrifice, and I slid the album across the oilcloth table runner toward them, suggesting they take a moment to reconnect with this version of themselves before the influx of funds altered the landscape of loyalties and legacies. The subtle revenge inherent in resurrecting that vulnerable memory serving to humanize the tension and expose the fragility beneath their polished exteriors as Clara recoiled slightly from the image as if it carried contagion, muttering something about the irrelevance of relics in modern times while hastily closing the cover, yet her haste only amplified the satisfaction I felt in reclaiming a sliver of narrative control through nostalgia's quiet power, a clever maneuver that diffused the immediate confrontation without yielding ground. But just as the air began to thicken with potential reconciliation or further discord, Clara straightened in her seat with a sharpness that commanded attention, her voice emerging edged with accusation as she leveled at me the charge of attempting blackmail by dredging up these historical fragments to leverage against their current stability, her words hanging in the charged silence like a gauntlet thrown down, forcing me to confront whether the shadows of the past were about to eclipse the fragile peace I'd nurtured in their absence. Clara's accusation of blackmail reverberated through the dining room with the force of a sudden summer storm rolling in from the Ohio plains, stirring up the remnants of our brunch into a chaotic swirl of half-eaten plates and cooling coffee that now tasted as bitter as the undercurrents it masked. And as I absorbed the sting of her words delivered with that polished venom she reserved for threats to her meticulously constructed world of social galas and gated estates, I couldn't help but reflect on how her affinity for all things extravagant had seeped into every corner of Mark's life since their wedding in that lavish Napa Valley ceremony back in 2003. transforming the practical young engineer I'd raised on thrift store finds and homemade birthday cakes into a figure who navigated life through the prism of luxury brands and networking events where appearances trumped authenticity every time, while I remained anchored in the rhythms of this modest homeware. The walls whispered stories of endurance rather than excess, from the faded wallpaper in the hallway bearing marks from Mark's childhood growth spurts to the sturdy oak cabinets in the kitchen stocked with staples from the church pantry that emphasized sharing over hoarding. The contrast sharpened in my mind as she paced the room, her heels imprinting faint scuffs on the area rug Tom's mother had woven by hand during the Depression era when every scrap of yarn counted toward warmth and survival. Her designer bag catching the light from the chandelier we'd installed ourselves after saving for months on overtime wages, and she launched into a defense of her choices, claiming those monthly $12,000 checks represented her commitment to family without the inconvenience of frequent cross-country flights that would disrupt her packed calendar of charity luncheons and yoga retreats, all while her eyes darted possessively toward the bag as if it embodied the fruits of her labor in curating an image that screamed success to her Bay Area peers who judged worth by zip codes and vehicle models rather than the depth of relationships forged in adversity. But beneath her protestations, a twist unfurled slowly like the unraveling of a tightly wound skein. As she paused mid-stride and confessed under Mark's watchful gaze that the money's true origin lay not solely in altruism, but in Tom's long-standing investment in her family's import business, a covert partnership initiated during Mark's fledgling startup phase when cash flow issues threatened to derail his ambitions, providing Clara with a stake in our estate that allowed her to enforce the payments as a means of safeguarding her interests should I ever decide to sell the house and redistribute assets. A revelation that washed over me like icy rain from a leaky roof during a midnight downpour because I'd long assumed the transfers stemmed from uncomplicated generosity rather than this intricate lattice of leverage tied to decisions Tom made in secrecy to protect his son's future without burdening me with the details amid his declining health. The conflict intensified as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the living room floor, casting elongated patterns that mirrored the stretching divides between us, with Mark squirming in his armchair, the one upholstered in a floral fabric I'd chosen for its durability over decades of spills and stories. His discomfort evident in the way he avoided my eyes while Clara continued her tirade about how my dependence on the church's communal support embarrassed their standing in circles where self-made narratives demanded independence from such rustic networks, her light disdain for the potlucks and prayer meetings that had sustained me through lonely nights when grief clawed at the edges of sleep, dismissing them as outdated relics unfit for the modern era of apps and advisors that streamlined life into efficient transactions. Feeling the familiar surge of indignation that had simmered since their arrival, I recognized the opening for a reprisal that would strike at the heart of her facade without descending into the chaos she seemed intent on provoking. So as she bent to retrieve her phone from the bag, probably to summon a rideshare back to their hotel suite with its plush linens and room service far removed from my simple suppers, I interjected casually about my recent tidying of Tom's desk drawers where stacks of yellowed receipts and ledgers from the shop days had resurfaced like ghosts unwilling to stay buried, then from the nearby bookshelf where I kept such documents organized in shoeboxes labeled in my neat handwriting, I extracted the faded receipt detailing that very investment transfer, folding it neatly alongside one of her most recent return checks that I'd set aside untouched for months, enclosing both in a plain manila envelope sealed with tape from the junk drawer stocked with odds and ends accumulated over years of resourceful living, and extended it toward her with a measured smile born from the wry amusement of turning the tables on her presumed superiority, suggesting she view this as my reciprocal contribution to the family ledger free of any encumbrances or expectations. The clever wit in that gesture lying in its implication of severing the financial tether she wielded so deftly while underscoring my thriving detachment through church-backed stability like the recent fundraiser that covered my property taxes without a single loan or favor owed. Her complexion blanched beneath the layer of foundation that evened out imperfections in a way my morning routine of soap and water never bothered with, the envelope clutched in her hand as if it burned, providing me a quiet thrill of vindication that diffused some of the room's oppressive heat without fully extinguishing the underlying embers. Yet, in the ensuing pause heavy with unspoken calculations, Mark reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, withdrawing a letter creased and aged to the texture of autumn leaves, his voice low and laced with urgency as he announced that this document altered the entire landscape of our conversation, and slid it across the coffee table toward me with fingers that betrayed a subtle tremor hinting at revelations poised to upend everything once more. Mark's letter rested on the scarred surface of the coffee table like a dormant explosive wrapped in fragile paper, its yellowed edges speaking volumes about the passage of time since Tom penned those words in the dim light of his bedside lamp during the final months, when chemotherapy sapped his strength, but not his resolve to tie up loose ends for the family he'd built from the ground up with calloused hands and unwavering determination, and as I reached for it with fingers that trembled slightly despite my outward composure forged in the fires of loss and self-reliance, the dilemmas cascaded through my thoughts like dominoes toppling in slow motion, questioning every acceptance of those monthly $12,000 infusions that had once seemed a buffer against the harsh realities of aging alone in a house filled with echoes of laughter now faded into memory, especially since the church's unwavering support through volunteer repairs and shared grocery runs had taught me that true security lay in communal bonds rather than conditional cash flows designed to maintain a facade of familial duty from afar. Unfolding the creases revealed Tom's familiar script, looping letters formed with the same pen he used for shop invoices back in the days when the auto parts business teetered on the brink during economic downturns that shuttered competitors left and right, detailing how he'd channeled funds into Clara's family enterprise not as a mere favor, but to quietly settle a substantial debt Mark incurred during his early entrepreneurial stumbles in the cutthroat tech scene where venture failures could derail promising careers overnight. A debt that Clara had astutely converted into this perpetual arrangement, ensuring the non-disclosure of those fiscal indiscretions that might tarnish their rising star status among investors and influencers who prize spotless reputations above all else. And the emotional undercurrents of betrayal twisted deeper within me as I realized Tom's protective silence had inadvertently ensnared me in a web of obligations I neither sought nor fully understood, making me ponder the choices I'd made in tolerating the arrangement for so long out of a misplaced sense of loyalty that now felt as burdensome as the antique trunk in the attic stuffed with keepsakes from happier eras. As twilight deepened outside the windows framed by sheer drapes that diffused the street lamp glow into soft halos, Mark and Clara insisted on extending the visit into a full dinner under the guise of hashing out these unearthed truths around the very table where we'd once celebrated milestones with toasts to futures bright and unclouded. So I busied myself in the kitchen pulling together a roast chicken seasoned with rosemary from the herb patch I'd tended since Tom's passing as a therapeutic ritual amid the grief that initially left me adrift until the church women's circle invited me to join their gardening collective where soil and stories alike healed wounds invisible to the eye, the savory aromas wafting through the house mingling with the undercurrent of tension that thickened like gravy simmering on the stove as we reconvened with plates heaped high and silverware clinking against china patterns chipped from robust use over decades rather than discarded for the latest trends. Clara dominated the discourse with her characteristic flair, weaving narratives of their high society engagements where philanthropy masked the competitive underbelly of status games played out in marble-floored ballrooms far removed from the community halls where my church hosted fundraisers for local scholarships and disaster relief, dismissing my lifestyle as quaint in a manner that carried a light vulgarity akin to calling out the absurdity of clinging to outdated comforts when progress demanded reinvention, all while positioning herself as the benevolent architect of my financial cushion without acknowledging how her manipulations twisted Tom's goodwill into a tool for control over the inheritance that rightfully anchored my remaining years in this home saturated with history from the cradle to the current conflicts. Yet the evening's twist materialized in Mark's subdued admission over the buttered rolls baked that morning with yeast from the pantry stockpile, confessing that he'd harbored knowledge of the debt's origins from the outset and permitted Clara to orchestrate the payments as a shield against confronting his own missteps that nearly cost them their foothold in the elite circles. A vulnerability that humanized him in my eyes, even as it frustrated the part of me urging a firmer boundary against such enabling dynamics, the growing discord amplified by Clara's escalating barbs about the church's potential to spread gossip that could ripple into their professional spheres where discretion equaled currency more valuable than gold. In the midst of this verbal sparring, I wove in subtle hints to stoke the uncertainty, casually, noting how Pastor Ellis, during a recent Bible study session, had expressed interest in reviewing family documents for spiritual guidance on stewardship, planting seeds of apprehension without overt aggression that made Clara's fork hesitate midway to her mouth laden with a morsel of the herb-crusted bird. And as the moment ripened amid the candlelight flickering from the centerpiece of wildflowers gathered from the yard that morning, I chose my reprisal with the precision of a seamstress mending a tear in heirloom fabric, serving her an extra portion while murmuring just audibly enough for Mark to catch that this recipe hailed from Tom's playbook for forgiving outstanding balances back in the shop days when trust rebuilt bridges stronger than steel, implying through the layered meaning that the scales of obligation now balanced precariously on the dinner table itself, the witty exposure of her contrived narrative landing with the satisfaction of a well-aimed dart that punctured her composure without shattering the evening's fragile truce, leaving her utensils suspended in midair as realization dawned on the clever inversion of power dynamics. However, before the hush could evolve into any form of resolution or retreat, Clara rose abruptly from her chair with the designer bag clutched like a talisman against the encroaching truths, her posture rigid as she declared in a voice edged with finality that she would sever all financial support immediately unless I capitulated by signing over the house deed on the spot, the threat reverberating through the room like thunder presaging a deluge and propelling me into a vortex of contemplation about the precipice upon which our fractured family now teetered. Clara's ultimatum about severing the financial lifeline unless I surrendered the house deed lingered in the air of my dining room long after her heels had clicked away down the hallway toward the front door, carrying with them the faint echo of finality that resonated deeper than any slammed exit ever could, leaving Mark to trail behind her like a reluctant shadow caught between loyalties fractured by years of prioritizing appearances over the raw bonds that once defined our family gatherings. Around this very table laden with meals that symbolized abundance born from effort rather than entitlement. And as the door shut with a soft click that seemed to seal in the unresolved tension swirling like dust motes in the beam of the porch light filtering through the window, I remained seated amid the cleared plates where remnants of the roast chicken congealed on porcelain edges chipped from decades of nurturing moments, both tender and turbulent, grappling with the ambiguity of it all. Because cutting off those $12,000 monthly wires would strip away the last veneer of their involvement in my life, forcing a reckoning with the independence I'd cultivated through the church's steadfast network of support that extended from emergency funds raised during bake sales to the quiet counsel of Pastor Ellis, who emphasized forgiveness not as weakness, but as a deliberate release from chains forged in secrecy and self-interest. The night stretched into a restless vigil where sleep evaded me as surely as clarity did. The old grandfather clock in the living room ticking away the hours with its pendulum swing mirroring the back and forth of my thoughts on Tom's letter and the debts it illuminated. Debts that Clara had weaponized into the standoff, while Mark's complicity in the silence spoke to a deeper erosion of the values we'd instilled in him during those formative years spent helping at the auto parts shop where mistakes were mended with hard work and apologies rather than monetary patches that obscured accountability. And by the time dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold over the rooftops of our neighborhood, where neighbors waved from porches fronted by vegetable gardens thriving on community swaps rather than imported exotics, I resolved to confront them one final time not in rage, but in the measured strength drawn from the women's circle at First Presbyterian, where stories of resilience shared over quilts and coffee had armored me against such manipulations, so I climbed into the station wagon Tom had meticulously restored in his workshop during healthier days, its engine humming with the reliability of parts sourced from his old suppliers that outlasted the flashier models clogging highways these days, and navigated the familiar routes toward the upscale hotel downtown where they lodged in suites overlooking the great Miami River that wound through the city like the twists of our entangled histories. Arriving in the lobby with its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that screamed transience in contrast to the permanence of my rooted existence, I found them at a corner table nursing coffees from porcelain cups far finer than my everyday mugs, but lacking the warmth of brews shared in church basements after services that knit souls together. And as Clara's designer bag perched on the adjacent chair like a silent witness to her poised defensiveness, I laid bare the unvarnished truth as it had crystallized in my mind overnight, articulating how those payments had never truly purchased harmony but merely deferred the inevitable confrontation over Tom's concealed interventions that bootstrapped their ascent at the expense of transparency in our family ledger. A confession that softened Mark's features into an echo of the boyish vulnerability I'd glimpsed in old photographs, prompting him to murmur admissions of how the dread of plummeting from their elevated perch had blinded him to the isolation he inflicted on me through absenteeism masked as ambition, even as Clara's posture stiffened with the calculated poise of someone accustomed to negotiating boardrooms where emotions served strategy more than sincerity. Yet the pivotal ambiguity persisted in the truths I withheld entirely. Subtle allusions to the pro bono attorney connected through the church's legal aid outreach who had pored over the investment documents and flagged potential irregularities that could unravel Clara's leverage if pursued. Hints dropped with the casualness of mentioning a recent sermon on stewardship that made her shift uncomfortably and eye the exits as if plotting an escape from the web tightening around her carefully spun narrative, building the suspense until the crescendo of my reprisal unfolded not in explosive confrontation, but in a parcel I'd assembled through the wee hours using materials from my sewing kit and the stationery drawer stocked with envelopes for thank-you notes to church benefactors, containing the entirety of the untouched checks returned in chronological order bound within a cover emblazoned with the title, Recipes for True Independence, where each page bore annotations detailing episodes of my flourishing without their input, such as the quilt auction that funded a new roof after hailstorms battered the town or the volunteer crew that cleared storm debris from my yard without a bill in sight, and presenting it across the table with a smile laced with the dry humor that had sustained me through widowhood's trials. I quipped that this served as my reciprocal Mother's Day offering, tangible evidence that contentment bloomed not from bank balances, but from severing the invisible tethers that bound one to another's whims. The witty profundity of that gesture piercing her armor as the bag beside her suddenly appeared as vacuous as the gestures it symbolized, eliciting a flicker of unease that cracked her composed veneer and left Mark nodding in quiet agreement, tinged with regret. In the aftermath, as they prepared to depart for the airport with promises of future dialogues that rang hollow against the backdrop of unsigned deeds and lingering enigmas from Tom's era, Mark enveloped me in an embrace that carried the authenticity of reconnection long overdue, whispering regrets that hinted at mending without guaranteeing it. And driving homeward past the church steeple piercing the morning sky with its cross gleaming in the sunlight that warmed the dashboard worn from countless errands for neighbors in need, I felt the uncertainty morph into a hard-won liberation laced with the persistent queries of whether my leniency toward their flaws had prolonged the pain or paved a path to genuine healing, pondering if familial ties inevitably thinned under the weight of unaddressed inequities, or if the real triumph lay in my solitary stand that invited them to reflect on truths I chose to guard closely, forever leaving the full measure of resolution suspended in the balance like the river's mist rising at dawn.